Hello, and welcome to IJI's webcast, Reviewing Results and Setting Expectations, working interactively with the business to achieve better results. In today's webcast, Kurt Bittner will share with attendees a better way to assess project health, what to review and when, setting expectations, and conducting reviews. I'm the moderator for today's sessions. A few general housekeeping notes to mention before we begin. Everyone will be on mute for the duration of the webcast. If you have a question, please submit it via the question function in the GoToWebinar control panel. And I will relay those questions to Kurt at the end of his presentation, and we will attempt to answer all questions before the end of our time today. An intro to Kurt. Kurt is Chief Technology Officer at Iver Jacobson. He has worked in the software industry for more than 25 years in a variety of roles. He was a key contributor to the early development of the Rational Unified Process, as well as more recently IBM's JAS project. His experience includes significant work in banking and finance, relational database system design and architecting, and consulting and mentoring a wide variety of clients on software development improvement strategies and approaches. He is the co-author of Use Case Modeling, Managing Iterative Software Development Projects, and the Economics of Iterative Software Development. Iver Jacobson International is a global IT services organization helping software organizations improve their way of working to deliver successful software projects. The ultimate goal for every development organization is to produce good software quickly and at low cost. At IJI, our focus and expertise is to resolve issues in the areas of bridging the gap between business and IT, defining requirements and ensuring that solutions meet the needs of the business, meeting project, budget, and deadlines, and getting teams to work effectively. I'll now pass the presentation over to Kurt, who will begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne, and thank you everyone for joining. Let's go to the next slide, please. So today's talk, the reason why I wanted to talk about this today is that I find a lot of project teams struggle with what to review, who to review it with, how to work with the business in reviews, how to work with project management offices. So these kinds of things are things that we often deal with when we work with different client organizations, helping both the organization and the teams work better in this respect. So it's an interesting set of things to talk about. So we'll talk first about the traditional approach to reviewing project health and why that particular approach rarely works and what to do about it. Then we'll talk about, within this context, what to review and when to review it, how to set expectations for those reviews, things to do during the reviews, and then how to fold the feedback back in. So why don't we go on to the next slide, please. So the typical approach that most organizations use in their project management offices or their governance organizations is to base project health measures primarily on schedule variance and sometimes augmented by artifact completion. So the way this works is that most project teams at the beginning of a project project manager has to come up with a very detailed project plan. They goes through perhaps some reviews, and eventually it's baselined, and then they're measured against that plan. And the problem with that is that the plan, when it's developed, is based on very little information. So this is before the project is really even started, before much in the way of needs understanding and requirements have been understood, perhaps before the solution's really even been defined. So it's a guess at best. And so when that gets locked in, though, the expectations are set and progress is measured in terms of completing activities on the plan and then measuring to see whether the activities were completed on the dates that they were intended on the plan. So in addition to that, the teams are often focused on heavy reliance on reviewing and completing artifacts as a sign of progress. So what we mean by that is best exemplified by the requirements document. So oftentimes it's regarded as a key milestone to have requirements signed off. And this is really a bit of a fallacy on everybody's part. The business knows that in signing it, that requirements will still change. It just goes through a bit of a nastier negotiation process. And the project team knows that the requirements won't change and that really getting sign-off doesn't really mean that much either. So everybody sort of plays this game, and in some organizations, that I've worked with, business just refuses to sign off on the requirements anyway. So the whole sign-off process is pretty ineffective. But so after this initial project planning, one of the problems is that risks are generally ignored. So it's typical at the beginning of a project to identify risks, but in most cases the risks are not all of the risks to the project, but often just the things that are related to whether the schedule is valid. So there's risks in there that there might not be enough resources, or some project team that you need to coordinate with might not deliver something on time. But there's a whole host of other risks, like the system may not perform well, it may not be secure, it may not meet the needs of the organization. It may cost too much. The project may take too long. You go down, a list of hundreds of risks that just about every project team faces, and it's better to do that in a conscious way. So these risks, as you're working with them, they are considered to be under control in the traditional approach when the plans are in place to mitigate them, as opposed to when they've actually been mitigated. So when those things become issues, they're reflected in the plan again. There's a re-baseline of the plan, and the measurement against the plan continues. So the reviews tend to focus on whether risks have become issues and whether the project team is adhering to the plan. So let's talk about what the problems with this are. Go on to the next slide, please. So some of the problems is that, as I said, the schedule is developed in almost complete absence of any real information about what needs to be done on the project. And so, if the original plan is flawed, then good performance can be punished, and you don't know, in fact, whether the team is performing well or if the original plan is flawed. And in many cases, the original plan is in fact flawed. So the way a lot of teams solve this, and it's not a good way to do it because you really want to get transparency on what's really happening, but the way teams solve it is that they have the official plan that they published, and then they have sort of a separate internal plan that they actually use to drive the day-to-day work. And that's not very effective because really there are good reasons why everybody should have visibility into project progress. And if we hide things behind a sort of a hidden plan, we lose the ability to see what's going on. So that makes it too easy to make it look like a project is under control when it's not. So other problems are that checking off activities as completed doesn't mean that real progress is being made. In other words, it just says that the activities you said you were going to do, you've done. It doesn't mean that they're the right activities or that you're actually progressing toward the real solution. And similarly, reviewing and completing artifacts doesn't mean the progress is being made, because just because you have a requirements document and have it signed off doesn't mean that those are all the requirements, nor does it usually mean that the requirements are correct. So there's a big problem getting people to actually pay attention at a sufficient level of detail in order to really give good feedback on those kinds of documents. So this is how an iterative approach has evolved, and this presentation doesn't go into what the benefits of an iterative approach are. We've got lots of other webinars recorded and white papers that you can go to our website and peruse and get background on that. So we'll focus more on this rest of the presentation on the specific measurement and review aspects. So next slide, please. So if you look at what should you review, then the most important thing are trends on different kinds of data. So we'd like to look at progress, quality, estimated completion based on the actual performance of the team, not the schedule, actual costs and projected costs based on the actual performance of the team, and then risk mitigated and tested through executable code. So on progress, the thing that we want to measure is how many coded and tested scenarios do we have. You can use other measures, and when I use the word scenario, you could also use user stories, you could use use case flows, you could use whole use cases, you could even use just backlog items, declarative requirements. But at some measure, the important thing is the completed, coded, and tested aspect is the important measure of progress. And so you'd like to see that starting off slow, gradually building, getting more productive over the course of the project, and then gradually tapering off at the end of the project. If you start to see things not go up as steeply as you get into the project, as the graph here shows, then you have a potential problem. You're not making as much progress as you thought, so you're going to have to get more productive later, or you're going to have to change the scope of the project, or you're going to have to find more resources, or a few other things. Risk exposure, similarly, we'll talk a little bit about how to measure this later on. We've also got some webinars and white papers on this as well. But the risk exposure, basically the cumulative magnitudes of all the risks that you're facing, magnitude being probability times impact for the risk, plotted over time. We should see that curve start off. It might climb as you identify new risks once you get into the project, and then you'd like to have it drop off pretty steeply to get more certainty about the work later in the project. So here on the curve, it's starting to flatten out sooner than you'd really like it to. So it suggests that there might be some problems the team's having in mitigating the risk. Estimate to complete based on the actual velocity, the actual productivity of the project team is useful to know to see whether you're actually as productive as you need to be to finish by the end. And defect trends, of course, it's important to look at that to see whether you are going to get the defects down to an acceptable level before the project is actually shipped or before it's put into production. Next slide, please. So the kinds of things that you need to review within the project team, and I'll include the business representatives or the product owners, depending on your terminology, in the project team. So every day, have an informal review at the stand-up where everybody goes around and talks about what they accomplished yesterday, what they're going to do today, and any blocking issues so that you can clear out those quickly. So the business, through the business owner or the business representative or product owner, has visibility into that every day. They're a participant in that. They get to ask questions, and then they're working with the team the rest of the time as well. Then once a week, an extended stand-up to review risk, progress, and quality. So taking a look at what was accomplished over a bit longer time span, is it tracking on what the team's expecting? To revisit the risks to see during the last week, were we able to reduce any risks, mainly by reducing the probability through executing and testing some scenarios of code that we built. And then outside the project team, it's usually not useful to share information outside of an iteration or until the end of an iteration with people outside the project team. But outside the project team, at the end of every iteration, you'd review those key measures that we talked about on the last slide and provide the commentary around what's been going on the project. So that's a good way to start the review, and then we'll talk about other things to review as we go on to the next couple slides. So other things that as we get into setting an iteration review, Leanne, if you could go back to the last slide, I think we missed a point. Right. So then phase end reviews, you want to ensure that risks are under control. So each of the phases in the unified process, and we big believers in that, is focused on a particular set of risks. So business risks in inception, technical risks in elaboration, execution risks in construction, and deployment risks in transition. So you would look at the risks broken out by phase to see by the end of inception, have we resolved all the business risks or at least brought them to an acceptable level, and similarly with the other phases. So these are the key things to review. Now we'll talk about some of the details. Next slide, please. So when you're doing an iteration review, the goals of the review, first of all, is make sure that everybody, the extended stakeholders now, understands what's been achieved, what remains to be done, and get agreement that the project's on track to achieving goals. So in doing that, it's important to manage expectations. They need to understand what was done during the iteration, and then it's always important, I feel, to show them something. So you want to demonstrate some portion of the system that was built so they get a tangible sense, not just looking at some nice graphs on a scorecard, but actually seeing something real. You might only take 5 or 10 minutes to do this, but it's really important to just have that sort of show of results in a concrete way. And then as you manage expectations, also gain agreement that the most important things are getting attention. So have them look at your priorities and the risks and make sure that everybody agrees that the plan looks good going forward. So in order to do that, you have to communicate transparently, and you can't have 2 sets of books. So they need to have visibility into the iteration plans, and they also need to have visibility into risk, progress, and quality trends that we talked about earlier. So in many organizations, this inspires a little bit of a crisis when people first encounter it. One is that they're not used to people talking frankly about risks, and they're used to hearing the standard risks like there might not be enough people or enough resources, but they're not used to hearing the risk that the technology that we've proven and that 20 other applications are using may not work for this project. But if that's the reality, if you're not sure that it will work and you're concerned about scalability, it's better to bring that issue up. Similarly, that on an iterative project, you tend to be talking about risks early in the project, and you tend to be tackling very hard problems early in the project, and that's all for good reasons. But everybody on a classic or a traditional approach is used to bad things happening at the end and everything being fine up until you start testing. So it's typical for projects to be reporting green all the way through, and then all of a sudden you start testing or you start doing integration and you start hitting problems. Well, when you start hitting problems early on an iterative project, that's actually a good thing because you've got a lot of time to take care of it. But the problem is that if people start to think, well, my gosh, we're only 2 weeks into the project and we already have all these risks and we already have all these challenges, how's it going to be at the end of the project? And they extrapolate forward to think, oh, it's still going to be bad at the end of the project, and it's bad now. The reality is that on an iterative project, you tend to tackle really hard things at the beginning. That tends to make the beginning of the project feel a little bit uncomfortable. But as you get those issues resolved and the risk curve drops, then things are much more stable and everybody feels a lot more comfortable. So next slide, please. So here's a bit of an outline on how to conduct the iteration review, what you should schedule, and you could use this as kind of the outline on the overall, the agenda on the iteration review. So first of all, walk through what business scenarios you've covered. You probably, until you get to the end of the project, you'll have gaps in business scenarios, but you can walk through which ones you've covered, what pieces you've implemented, and what pieces remain to be done. So step by step, showing what was completed is often a useful thing, at least among the key things that would be critical to the stakeholders. So maybe step through some key business scenarios to show that demonstrable value. You already will have had feedback on this, so the purpose of the meeting is not at all really to get their feedback on things, but it's to communicate progress and generate some enthusiasm for the work that's been done. So if there are issues that have come up, try to table those, keep them offline, keep the focus on showing progress and just communicating. Then you want to go through the risks, show what risks were retired and reduced, and which risks have maybe been added, if there are any. Describe how those risks were reduced by tackling scenarios so people start to get an understanding of how this iterative process works and that it really is driven by risk prioritization. And then review the work plan for the next iteration, which is only the backlog items that you're going to do in the next iteration in their priority. So not the whole list. You don't want to open up that to the whole discussion. And then if there are any expected changes to completion date and budget performance, you discuss how you could possibly descope either in the next iteration or subsequent ones to keep the project on track. Next slide, please. So when you're walking through scenarios, there's some techniques that might be helpful to do that. First of all, introduce the scenario, talk about how it starts, what business value it achieves, and then just walk through a show and tell of the scenario, giving basically, trying to paint a little story around how somebody's using the system, and then take questions or feedback at the end. So basically try to get through the whole scenario without interruptions. And then if there are questions or feedback, walk through the scenario to gather the feedback and work step by step and have somebody recording the issues. And then, as you end the session, just briefly summarize the feedback and explain the next steps. Talk about how this feedback goes into the backlog, where it will be prioritized. And typically the feedback that you're getting now, you don't want to just automatically put into the next iteration unless it's really critical. So you talk about, are these things more important to deal with than things that we already have planned for the next iteration? And if so, then let's talk about the relative priority. But don't feel like you need to respond to everything immediately. So it's perfectly fine have it go in the backlog, and most people are fine with that. They just want to make sure that their feedback is taken into account at some point. Next slide, please. So when you communicate these review results back, part of what you're trying to do with reviews is to build some support in the organization for what you're doing. Countless organizations that we deal with, there's a real divide between business and IT, a lack of trust on both sides. And some of this happened, or most of it I think happens because of just poor communication. There's not much visibility from IT back to the business on how the project works. It's kind of all kept a mystery. Business constantly sees projects that are green until they're a big surprise at the end, so they feel that there's a real credibility problem there. And so part of what you can do to improve that over time is to try to do better at communicating results throughout the whole project and keeping people involved and informed. So first of all, everybody likes to feel like what they contributed was worthwhile, so you want to thank them for their results and actually make note of significant contributions or recommendations that they made if they made something. So if you can, so that's why I say differentiate between real participation and merely showing up. Summarize the feedback that was given, and then summarize the planned action. So this is sort of a post-review email or a message that you would send out, and just make sure that, and this is what gets usually logged in the iteration review results when you submit things into the PMO for governance purposes. Next slide, please. So, summary, the traditional measures of performance that are used, adherence to schedule, don't give us very good visibility into what's really happening on a project. Partly because the project plan is, the whole approach is really to a pretty large degree flawed. The plan is prepared, in absence of an understanding of what problem needs to be solved, an understanding of the solution that's going to be built. And even if it's updated later, it still ends up being something that tends to be relatively difficult to change. So oftentimes the schedule, when the schedule is measured by the PMO, there's a measure on how many times has the schedule changed, with more times being a bad thing. In other words, people think that if you're changing the schedule a lot, the project is out of control, and in fact, you may simply be adapting to the realities on the ground, and that's a good thing. So this whole idea that a plan can be used to track real progress and real project health, the big plan up front, is really kind of a fallacy. So we want to use these trends on risk, progress, and quality to give us a better sense for what's for how the project is going. So in addition, as we go through and we work on reviewing the results frequently, there's daily reviews with the whole project team and an inner circle of extended stakeholders. There's weekly reviews with that same team where there's a bit broader look at how the project has gone in the last week. And then there's end of iteration reviews, which may be, end of an iteration might be anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks after the start of the iteration. Those are with external stakeholders, and you do those. And then, of course, there's an end of project review. Some of those end of iteration reviews are also end of phase reviews, so they take on a little bit of an additional focus on the type of risks that are dealt with in that particular phase. So important thing is you go into the reviews, make sure everybody knows what to expect, make sure they have an understanding of how they participate, have a good structure for the way the review is going to be conducted, and then make sure you follow up on the review. So with that, let me open it up to questions, turn it back to Leanne, and we will take some questions. I think Leanne also has some announcements.
Thank you very much, Kurt. I have received some questions, but just a reminder to everybody that you can submit your questions via the control panel in GoToWebinar, the question function. And just a reminder in the meantime, before we start asking these questions to Kurt, is the next webcast is set for December 8th, and in that webcast Kurt will be discussing engaging with project sponsors. So that's set for December 8th. A recording of this webcast will be made available as of tomorrow, and all attendees will receive a link to that recording, plus a reminder about next next month's webcast on December 8th. So, Kurt, the first question is, 2 seconds here, sorry. It's not wanting to show me the whole thing, so I just have to scroll a bit. Sorry, it's going to take. It is best to categorize the risk using the phases. That's a question. Would this address the situation where you may be tempted to address a high magnitude of risk for, say, a construction phase while you are still in inception? How do you handle that?
Right, that's a great point. So the risks are categorized by their type. So business, technical, and I use the term logistical, which basically just means being able to get a lot done with a small number, or with the number of people that you've got assigned on the project, and then deployment. So each of those aligns well to the purpose of each of the phases. And you're absolutely right. If you stay focused on that, you should not be working on any risks that are really construction phase related risks in the inception phase. You've gotten ahead of yourself. You haven't even proved whether the solution is viable at that point. So that does give you a nice way to focus your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, what trends do you see in the industry regarding PMO groups, specifically related to planning using an achievements-based approach rather than activities? Are they evolving?
I think they are, and many of the, I can't really talk about the industry, but I can certainly talk about the clients that I work with. There's a recognition that the schedule-based approach that I was describing hasn't been working very well, and no one is really happy with the fact that they end up getting surprised late in the project with things being green and then all of a sudden going red and that sort of behavior. So people are definitely opening up to the possibility of working in a new way. And I think one of the things that is helping is that when we communicate better, so I think that iterative and agile approaches have not been communicated particularly effectively by some people. So there's a belief on the part of some that an agile or iterative approach can't deliver to a specific date with a specific budget. You can absolutely deliver to a specific date with a specific budget. What has to vary is the scope, and that's exactly the same as on a traditional project. This whole, we've all talked about how you can, change, scope, schedule, or budget, but you can't fix. I mean, you can fix 2 of those 3, but you can't fix the 3rd one. So, you can vary the scope, but then you've usually got to vary the cost and the schedule, and so on. So, so I think we need to more effectively communicate that an agile or iterative approach doesn't mean that you're just sort of wandering around aimlessly forever until somebody decides that it's done. That you actually can measure to an end date. What you don't do is you don't put a big plan together for the whole thing, but you plan in monthly iterations and you converge upon the overall solution. So that's one thing that's helping, is having a better way of explaining. And the second thing is to talk about these measures that we mentioned, is that there is actually really good data coming off an iterative project about risk and progress and quality and productivity that is usually absent on a traditional project. So you have many more indicators to tell you whether things are on track or not, and you can get a sense for where the real cause of the problem is based on those indicators. So I find an iterative project is actually, well, I should say, it provides the opportunity to more effectively manage than the traditional project. But that's not what people have been conditioned to, and we're working on that. I think organizations are starting to see the light.
Thank you, Kurt. The next question is a long one. So, if a phase milestone is completed during an iteration, should the phase assessment occur within the iteration, or wait until the iteration assessment? We sometimes have just a few things left to complete a phase when planning an iteration. Or should we curtail the iteration when the phase seems to have been completed, assess, then begin another iteration for the new phase?
Right. So that's a good question. So the way to think about this is that you're trying to do a couple of things with iterations. One is to establish a kind of rhythm or a heartbeat for the project. So delivering every 2 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever your time period is. And it's disruptive for everybody to sort of be varying the lengths of iterations. So when you're planning an iteration, let's say you get to the end of an iteration and you can see that there's, in the next iteration, you're going to accomplish the objectives for your phase. You will have mitigated all the risks, but you've got some, and so you've got some capacity to do additional work. There's nothing particularly wrong about pulling some additional things off the backlog and going ahead and starting those things in that particular iteration. So make the phase assessment at the end of the iteration during which you complete that phase, rather than doing sort of full stop and then having to start up again. It just kills the rhythm and momentum of the project. And you'll do a little bit of work on some things that are in the next, would be related to the next phase. So there's a slight risk that you get to the end of the phase assessment and you look at it and you thought you'd mitigated it, but when you really run it past all the stakeholders, they're not comfortable with that and you have to go back again. Well, it's better to keep the momentum going. So I would not stop the iteration, conclude the phase, and then restart it with another shorter iteration, and then get back on the whatever your normal iteration length is.
Thank you. Okay, next question. What is seen as the biggest challenge for a PM in moving from a traditional model to an agile iterative model?
It's a good question, and I think the biggest one is really ingrained habits, and there are a lot of ingrained habits that will have to change for a PM. So if we go down the list, the first one we've been talking about is that they're used to doing a detailed schedule for the whole project, and it makes them and other people who are used to doing that very uncomfortable not to have a detailed schedule for the whole project, even though when you prompt them on this, they agree that most of that schedule is probably wrong, but it's a comfort thing. It's what they're used to doing. So that's sort of one thing. They've got to get comfortable with the new techniques and new way of working. The second thing is that they're used to doing that themselves without much input from the project team, typically. And on an iterative project, it's much more collaborative. You work as a team, as a group, and the project manager isn't so much developing a plan and then assigning tasks to people and then tracking people against those tasks, as they are working to remove roadblocks and working to coordinate issues and force issues to the fore. So it becomes much more of an interactive, coaching, interpersonal, day-to-day, hands-on kind of experience, as opposed to a more passive relationship of scheduling, assigning, tracking, where you can do a lot of that work sitting in a cubicle in front of a spreadsheet. So that also pushes the comfort, pushes on the comfort level of many PMs who are steeped in the traditional approach. Now, in fairness, many project managers work in that way anyway, and they are constantly working to remove roadblocks. And so it's more that the kind of project manager who's perhaps used to a more passive approach is going to have to change. The ones who do a more active approach will actually find the iterative approach to be more comfortable. I think the third big thing is that the iterative projects work best with a self-organizing team. In other words, it's not the project manager assigning tasks to people, but it's the people looking at volunteering to do tasks and making a commitment to do that, and then being accountable to the rest of the team, including the project manager, for completing those tasks. So the project manager may still facilitate the discussion around did you get the work done, but it's not the it's not as directive as in the traditional approach. So there's a number of subtle changes. They're not huge changes, but because the behaviors are so ingrained, it takes a while for people to get used to this. And we find usually it takes 3 or 4 iterations before a project manager can work independently, and up until that point they need some help in getting over some of those obstacles.
Thank you. The next question, in construction the risk profile is much lower than earlier in the project. So should you still plan based on those risks, or should you adjust to a more objective-driven approach?
So the approach in general, it varies a little bit over the course of the project. So generally, if we sort of remove the risk perspective, what would you do with the backlog in terms of prioritization is that you would have the business walk through the backlog, do a rank ordering of the backlog, and say, that's the order in which I think things are important. So you're not doing low, medium, high, or must, should, could, won't, but you're basically doing a rank order, forced ranking of the backlog. So how risk sort of morphs that a bit, especially in inception and elaboration, and actually primarily in elaboration, is that you actually want to order the list based on risks instead of business priority. And then one of the risks that you always need to think about is that the business may not see adequate progress. So if you're working on all things that are invisible to them, then you need to do some things that will show them some results. And so, business value becomes a bit of a tiebreaker. It also can force some of the backlog items higher to throw in a few things that would be meaningful to the business. So in the elaboration phase, the ordering of the backlog is a balance between risk-based ordering and business-based ordering with a bias towards risk, but not completely ignoring the business ordering. If you've been successful at mitigating the risk in the elaboration phase, then what happens in the transition phase is that risk no longer is a dominant ordering factor, and it's simply based on business priority. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay. Thank you, Kurt. I believe that was the last question. I have received a couple of questions about the recording. So the recording will be made available tomorrow. So we do record the session. And we generally do not make the slides available, but we make the recording available. So as I mentioned, that will go out. You'll receive a link to be able to view that tomorrow. And no more questions. So I don't know, Kurt, if you had any last-minute thoughts you wanted to add, or we'll end it. We'll end it there.
I think we can wrap it up there.
Wrap it up.
To go out to our website. There's a number of other webinars that relate to the topics we've been discussing, and you might get some benefit out of those, and some white papers to download as well.
Great. Thank you. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you, Kurt. Have a great day.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks again.